Hi, during this global pandemic called COVID-19, we're all trying to manage the tension between grief and hope and what we can do to get going through it, to keep going through it. And today I want to cover a topic from grief to hope, how to lift each other up. Hi, I'm Rich Harwood. Welcome to another episode of Harwood Half Hour. This is the third in a series we're doing called Turning Outward Together during this pandemic. It's a way to help all of us stay grounded in these trying and challenging, amazingly challenging times. Uh, you can go to our Facebook page and find the first two episodes we did. The first one was on why we need community now during this pandemic. The second one was being intentional when you're afraid. Go to our Facebook page. You'll see a banner there. Click it on. You'll see the playlist, and you can get access to the first two episodes. This is the third in a series. We'll just keep doing them as long as we need to do them. Thanks so much for joining me. Shoot me a message and let me know that you can hear me and see me. We've had some technical difficulties getting this one started because Facebook just changed the interface for these things, and it was a little complicated and confusing, but here we are. So hopefully you can hear me. Hopefully I'm joining you live, and hopefully we can cover what I think is an incredibly important topic today. As we're going through the next 20 minutes, I'd love for you to think about this question and to write in responses. I can see people signing in. So David Selb, thanks for writing and let me know you can hear me. Here's the question. In what ways are you trying to manage the tension between grief and hope during COVID-19? In what ways are you trying to manage the tension between grief and hope during COVID-19? Before each of these sessions, these special sessions that I've been doing called Turning Outward Together, I've been asking people to write in topics. And today the topic that came back was how do we deal with grief and how do we move to hope? And one foundation CEO wrote to me this that I wanted to share with you today. Quote, I've been thinking a lot about grief. How do we turn outward when we're managing our individual and collective grief, she wrote. And I was reading an article this morning at breakfast, and there was a documentary producer who's really well known who was quoted in the article I was reading, who said, quote, the grief on a national level hasn't even started yet, unquote. The grief on a national level hasn't even started yet. And I don't know about you, but for me personally, all of this COVID-19 stuff has really started to sink in. You know, I think when we heard the president say we're going another 30 days, in many parts of the country where we need to remain in our homes, stay in place, isolate ourselves from one another, practice social distancing. I think for many of us across the country, this pandemic really hit home. We're really confronting a crisis like we've never confronted in our country before in terms of a pandemic like this. And we're starting to realize it's not going to go away. There's no magic bullet here. There's no magic answer. And I think at those moments when something like this begins to hit, when it starts to sink in, when we start to recognize that we're in something for the long haul, when we start to recognize that there might be and there will be losses involved here, this notion of grief begins to hit us. And I think for many of us, for many Americans, I think in particular, sometimes we try to deny that we're in grief. We just try to keep on moving. There can be a sense from political leaders, even some political leaders today, that they just try to gloss over it and say, everything's going to be fine, just go about your business. It was like during 9/11 when the president said, don't worry about it, go shopping at the mall. We're hearing similar messages from Washington, D.C. and many state capitals. Don't worry about it. And those tunes are just starting to change now, all these days and weeks into it. There's a sense of false hope that's provided to us at times that somehow or another we've got this all under control when look, we can watch the news, we can see what's happening. There's a contagion spreading clear across the country. And as so many people like Dr. Fauci, the epidemiologist, the infectious disease specialist, has said, a contagion like this doesn't discriminate by the color of our skin, by our creed, by our heritage, by where we live, by whether, yes, it's hitting New York City hardest now, but eventually it will begin to spread into rural areas across our country. And this grief that we feel initially is kind of like a whisper, just whispering softly to us. It's like a shadow that can follow us around and that we can't get away from no matter how we try. And inevitably, at times, it will overwhelm us. We will feel the full effect, the full potency, the full force, the full power of this grief come over us. Like that documentary producer said, the grief that we're going to experience hasn't even really started yet. I know for myself on a personal level, when I wake up in the morning, I can feel this grief starting to insert itself into my life and to start to surround me. I feel increasingly this sense of grieving about the Institute, about the Harwood Institute, that I've built this thing with so many other people, with many of you over 30 years. And I can feel this grieving process begin about, am I going to lose this? Just when I believe that the Institute is important to what we're doing in the country, what the country needs moving forward, am I going to lose this? Am I going to lose my staff? Am I going to lose the coaches who have been working with us for so many years? Will we lose the network that's been built? Will all of this somehow just disappear and somehow evaporate into thin air? I know I feel that grief starting to hit me and hit me hard. There are so many other people in the country, maybe you, who are feeling something much more acute and potentially damaging, the loss of a job, the loss of our local economies, the closing down of all these businesses that people have built. There's a sense of grief about our public health, about our national economy. There's people grieving who are part of the gig economy, who are artists, who are sole practitioners, who have no place to go, no one to turn to. At least they don't feel as though they have anyone to turn to, and now they may be isolated in their homes and wondering what's going to happen, and they feel increasingly alone. A sense of acute loneliness and a deepening of a sense of loneliness. This grief is here and it's going to hit, and we're going to have to deal with it. Now, as many of you know, I've spent my entire adult life working with so many communities who have been hit hard, who have been traumatized by powerful, deep effects. I worked, as many of you know, in Newtown, Connecticut, who experienced acute grief after the massacre there. I worked in communities like Flint, Michigan, that experienced a more chronic grieving process that I'll talk about in a few minutes. And there are so many rural communities, some of which we're working in today, that are suffering sort of a silent grieving, where there's a sense of a lost way of life and a search for how to recover it or reclaim it or rebuild it. And that's a different kind of grieving than, for instance, in Newtown, which was so acute and so immediate. What I've learned over the last 30 years in terms of doing this work is that there are lessons. There are lessons from these experiences about how we can move from grief to hope, and how, in doing so, we need to lift each other up. And I can't underscore this enough. The way in which we're going to move from grief to hope is not on our own. It doesn't happen by sitting in your bedroom alone. It doesn't happen by sitting in your living room alone. It doesn't happen by sitting and watching videos on your computer alone. We need each other now more than ever. And we just don't need each other. We're going to have to actively lift each other up. And that's what I want to talk about today. How can we lift each other up so we can move from grief to hope together and leave no one behind? In a recent interview, just this week, in fact, yesterday, I was asked on a podcast, if there's a tipping point in communities where communities have a tipping point where they move from grief to hope. And I thought it was a great question, but my answer was quick and it was certain based on what I've learned. And it's this: there is no tipping point. It's more like an arc, and it's a series of steps, and it takes time. And so while we talk a lot about flattening the curve of the COVID crisis, I believe we need to increase the arc from moving from grief to hope. And we need to get on this arc and make sure that we actually move and take certain steps. And so what I want to do today, in the next few minutes that we have together, is outline 4 steps. There are many, but I want to outline 4 key steps that I think are really critical on this arc of moving from grief to hope. I hope you're still with me here. So this is a really important topic for us to cover. And it's important because we're all experiencing this, and it's important because we need each other to lift each other up to get on this arc and move through this arc together. So here's step number 1. We need to provide space for us to express sorrow and grief. You know, when I first started working in Flint, Michigan in the 1990s, they were experiencing at that time, they had experienced at that time and continue to experience a loss of tens of thousands of auto jobs. I think by the time I got there, they had lost 30,000. They continued to lose them while we kept working. And when we started to engage people there to work with them in terms of how they could come together and move their community forward, what we realized really quickly was that people weren't ready to talk about the future of their community. There was so much frustration. There was so much anger about being left behind, about auto plants being closed down, about people being thrown out of work. It was a traumatic experience. There was deep anger and frustration and concern about what was going to happen. When I started working in Newtown, Connecticut, when I was called in after the massacre there, which you remember in 2012, 21st graders were shot down and 6 adults were murdered. And there, when I started to work with the community, in particular a task force there, we couldn't just push aside the grief and the sorrow that the community was feeling. You know, our task was to figure out what to do with this school building. But what I realized when I started to work there was that our real concern was how to help the community pivot from trauma and despair to healing and hope. And I remember when the task force started to make progress amid their grief and sorrow, and we had announced that we were going to make a decision in an upcoming meeting. The Wall Street Journal had actually run an article that morning that I was reading at breakfast before I flew up to Newtown to run the meeting. 30 teachers from the Sandy Hook Elementary School released a letter the night before saying that under no conditions would they return to that elementary school where they experienced that mass murder, that massacre. And at that point, when the decision was getting closer, it sparked them, it spurred them, it brought out, it stirred within them a deeper sense of grief that they felt they needed to express and express to the task force and the rest of us working on this. And so here's what I know about grief and sorrow and making space for it. And this is going to be really important for us as we move through this time together, that there is no schedule to experience grief and sorrow. There is no timetable to express grief and sorrow. There is no way for us to say to people, in the next 3 weeks, we're going to create space for you to express your grief and sorrow. And then, by the way, your time is up and it's time to move on to talk about something else. There is no timetable, no schedule, no way to force this. There is no mechanism for it. What we have to do in our community starting today is that we need to make room for one another to express our sorrow and our grief about what's happening around us. And so to lift each other up, what I'm going to ask you to do, what I need you to do, what the people around you need from you and what you need from each other, is that we need to be attuned to one another. We need to proactively ask people questions about how they're doing. We need to listen to each other's responses and not rush them, not tell people we're out of time, not tell people we need to get to the next topic, but we need to listen and we need to leave room. And this is necessary for us to do. It's necessary and it's pivotal. And so to be heard, as you know, is to offer someone hope. To be heard is to offer someone hope. And so in this time, right now, we need to make room for people to express their sorrow and grief. And when we do, they will feel heard. And when they feel heard, they will begin to feel some semblance of hope. We've got to make room for this. We've got to make space for this. It's the first thing we need to do. Second, if the first one is provide space to express sorrow and grief on this arc that we need to get on to move from grief to hope, the second point is this: we need to pivot to our individual and shared aspirations. The challenge for us in expressing our sorrow and grief when I worked, for instance, in Flint, was that we couldn't wallow in it. If we allowed people, if we just let things go their natural course, people would have just wallowed in their grief and sorrow about their lost jobs and about what had happened to them. And what we realized was at some point we gently needed to start asking them by saying, we hear you. We understand what you're saying. Now, tell us your individual and shared aspirations for moving forward. Tell us your individual and shared aspirations for moving forward. In Newtown, as I said, our challenge was to help people pivot from trauma and despair to healing and hope. And so while we made lots of room for people to talk about all the challenges that they felt, we heard from families of victims who had lost first graders. We heard from families of survivors. We heard from people who had lost their businesses. We heard from the teachers I mentioned. There was a point at which we said, okay, so do we want to move forward? Do we want to talk about the future of the building? Do we want to see if we can reach some kind of common ground about how to move forward? And so there, the question was, could we gently pivot from their trauma and despair to what might come next as a next step? But here's the thing. When we try to make this pivot, so many of us, the mistake we make is we try to move too fast. We try to bite off the whole thing. We try to say, okay, we've done our grieving, we've expressed our sorrow, now let's fix the problem and let's solve what's before us and let's just move forward as fast as we possibly can. Sometimes we make the mistake of creating utopian visions. This is what happened in Flint before we showed up. There was this business consultant that was brought in from the West Coast that works with businesses, and they created these 4 scenarios, almost utopian scenarios, that they wanted people to choose from about the future of Flint. Heck, people didn't want to choose some utopian vision. They were grieving. They were experiencing sorrow. They wanted to know how they could move forward, what the next step was. They're not interested in utopia. They're interested in how they can improve their lives tomorrow and the next day and the day after. You know, one of the things I've learned in working with communities like Flint and Newtown and others is that there is no perfect solution for imperfect, inexplicable situations. And so when we try to make this pivot to our shared and individual aspirations, we need to watch ourselves. We need to be careful. We need to be sensitive to where people are. We need to be sensitive to where we are as individuals. None of us is looking for a utopian vision. We're looking that today and tomorrow can be a little bit more hopeful than yesterday. And so our aspirations are so important, as so many of you have heard me say before, because our aspirations come from our gut about things that we care about, things that matter to us. Just try this. Ask someone in your office virtually. Ask someone that you're at home with. Ask someone that you have a happy hour with virtually. Ask them what their aspirations are individually and for their community moving forward. And I guarantee you, there will be things from their gut that matter to them, that project out. There will be things that are actionable, doable, and achievable in the near and medium term. And these aspirations, they give us a sense of hope, because when we start to talk about them with other people, we start to recognize that while there may be differences in our communities, and in our politics, there are certain things that we share together. And in hearing that we share certain things together, they give us a sense of comfort that we're in something together, that we're part of something larger than ourselves, that there's some way in which we can come together and work on something together. And it may be something as small as my aspiration is that we connect every day so that I feel some sense of connection. I just did this with my rabbi, who's one of my best friends. We decided that once a week we're going to get together over Zoom and we're going to talk together because our aspiration was individually, we need to stay connected. We need to keep talking about these issues. We need to keep talking about how his synagogue, my synagogue, and our institute is working in communities to help us move forward. And so that was one small step that we decided to do. So here's what I'm asking you: to lift each other up. Ask someone else, ask your staff, ask folks you go to church with what their individual and shared aspirations are moving forward. Post them, put them on your Facebook page, Twitter them, tweet them out, put them on some common shared Google document that you have together and list them together. Every meeting, every day, pull them out and remind yourselves of them, because we need to remember what we're for, not simply what we're afraid of, what we're scared of. We need to remind ourselves the direction that we want to move in together and that we can co-create together. When we have this new direction, when we have this sense of what we can co-create together, we are, through dint of doing that work and creating that expression together, creating hope together. And so if the first point is that we need to provide space to express our sorrow and grief, and the second point is ultimately we need to pivot gently to our individual and shared aspirations, the third point is this: we need to look for small wins to gain hope. We need to look for small wins to gain hope. The challenge, as I've already alluded to, is that we try to go too fast. We look for the home run. We look for the magic bullet. We look for the magic solution. We look for the magic wand. And you know, I don't need to tell you this, it's not coming. There is no magic politician who's going to solve all these problems by him or herself. There is no single institution who can conquer this pandemic on their own. There is no set of organizations or groups on their own that can do this. We're in a situation where we need to become builders, where we need to take one step at a time and just keep building one step at a time, one step after the next step after the next step. And when we take those steps, as small as they might be, even me just reaching out to someone and say, I want to schedule a weekly Zoom conversation with you to talk about what's going on, we begin to regain confidence in ourselves that we have the innate capabilities to do things. In Flint, we created something called Take a Step, which some of you have used. They're called the Ask Questions now. 4 simple questions. There was such a lack of trust and there was so much anger and frustration in Flint that we realized that one of our biggest challenges was simply getting people to step over that threshold underneath their front door from their private home life into community life. And we asked them, when you step over that threshold, just ask your neighbor these 4 basic questions. And when they did, they began to regain a sense of confidence. They could see and hear one another again. And that started to lead to small wins, people picking up garbage in their neighborhoods, sweat equity housing groups working in local neighborhoods, the local theater, the Flint Cultural Corporation, putting on new productions that reflected people's concerns and their aspirations for moving forward. In Newtown, Connecticut, amid their sorrow and grief that continues to this day, we reached a tough agreement about tearing down that school building and building anew with a different footprint. It was just the first public step that community took together. And now, years later, they continue to take one step after another after another. And so it is these small steps forward we need to concentrate on. They're happening all around us in the country right now. And so to lift each other up, what I'm asking you to do is to search, go in search for these small wins, be proactive, be proactive, and don't discount them. I've said this before on different topics. No action is too small to be worthy. No thing that we do together is too small to be important. Nothing is too small to have value. Nothing is too small to give us a spark of hope. And that's what we need right now. And so lift them up, celebrate them. And when we do, they will give us hope. So here's the fourth thing, the fourth step, which is we need to take back our shared narrative. As you've heard me say before, these narratives, these shared narratives we have, they set our mindset, they set our attitudes, they set our behaviors and actions. And right now, the narrative in our country is that we are being defeated by this pandemic. The narrative continues to be that we have politicians in Washington, D.C. who are playing games, which I actually believe is true. But these narratives, they can overtake us. If you turn on the nightly news, the narrative from the nightly news can just overwhelm you. And you can be set back into grief and sorrow. I know after the first 5 minutes of watching the nightly news, I turn to my wife and we turn it off and we go and do something else. I tend to do crossword puzzles or do something else. And so we've got to take back, though, proactively our shared narrative. In Flint, there was this persistent negative narrative that we had to fight against. In Newtown, there was the persistent narrative of fear and rage. But there was also this narrative of that we don't want this one incident, this one massacre to define who we are moving forward. And so as we try to take back our shared narrative, again, we cannot pretend that everything is okay. It's not. It's not. They're estimating, as you know, 100,000 deaths up to 240,000 deaths. Let's hope to God that it's lower than all of those estimates. But many people will die. Many people will die. Many of us will lose our jobs. Many of us will lose our organizations and businesses. It's all true. It's going to happen. It is happening. But we have a choice to make. Will we be overcome and will we succumb to the negative narrative that says we will be defeated by this? Or will we rise up and proactively take back our shared narrative into a more can-do spirit that harkens and taps into who Americans are and who we have been since the founding of this country and what we have repeated time and again when we've dealt with challenges, whether they're the stains on our civic fabric or they're things like war and massacres and gun shootings. So I believe our time is to take back this narrative, to restore our belief in ourselves and in one another that we can actually come together and get things done. So in finding those small wins that I was just talking about, here's what you need to do with them. You need to tell stories to one another, to each other, about these small wins. And so to lift each other up, here's a suggestion. We do it in my office every morning when we meet as a staff. Start each meeting with asking people to tell a story of hope. Where have you seen in the country, in your community, in your work, in your organization, a story of hope, where people have come together and produced something that they couldn't have necessarily produced on their own, but together we're moving forward. You've got to keep doing this day after day. We need to create a new habit. We've got to counter all the negative news that's coming into our homes and over the airwaves. And we've got to weave them together to show that there is a new pattern emerging. Yes, there is a contagion spreading across our country that is killing people. But here's the thing I want you to know, and I need you to remember, and I need you to do. There is another contagion spreading across our country, a positive contagion of people coming together and ensuring that kids are getting educated every day while they work online. A contagion that's ensuring that seniors aren't shut in and experience loneliness and going without food or their prescription drugs and people reaching out to them. There's a contagion happening of people coming together and making sure that small businesses and restaurants are banding together and volunteers are coming together to make sure that people have meals every day and every night and they're not going hungry. There's a positive contagion spreading across our country. And just as we need to acknowledge the negative one that's that's working against us, we need to start to talk about the positive one that we're co-creating together as Americans. And so there is no tipping point. I wish there were. That means that somehow or another, some magic thing would occur and we would simply move from grief to hope. Instead, there's an arc. And in order for this arc to take hold and to move and to be productive, all of us and each of us need to get on this arc together. And over time, we need to together take these 4 steps. And together we need to lift each other up, because that's the only way to move from grief to hope as a community and as a society. And so let's take these 4 steps. Let's make space for us to express grief and sorrow. Let's pivot gently to our shared individual and collective aspirations. Let's take back our shared narrative. And let's make sure that we're looking for small wins to engender hope and a sense of possibility in one another. And so let me end with this. My hope for you today is this: that first and foremost, that you take good care of yourself and your loved ones, and that you stay in good health and good spirits. And in doing so, that you don't turn away from one another and from each other, but that we turn toward one another, turn outward toward one another. And let us move from grief to hope by lifting each other up. Next Wednesday, I'll be back with another special episode in COVID-19, Turning Outward Together. This Friday, in 2 days, look for a podcast, How Do We Fix It?, which I'm going to be appearing on, which we'll make sure we'll distribute to our network. You can also go to your favorite platform where you can find podcasts. Again, How Do We Fix It?, where I talk more in depth about how we can help move the country forward. In the meantime, stay well, be well. Thanks for joining me. Let's lift each other up and let's get on this arc so that we can move from grief to hope in these trying times. Thanks so much for joining me. Be well.